Good evening. It's early. It's not early. It's Saturday evening, 7 p.m. 7:30. I have read about old old jet fighters the whole day. So let's read more American history. So, but I will need many months to read. But I start to get tired. My voice is tired because I've been talking many hours today. So I need many months to read it. I did buy more paper. Maybe I have to write everything down. All the Americans, so I could close a little bit down maybe. But we need to start reading so I can close something down, because I cannot have 1000 web pages open like many months and years. So we need to start reading. This one I close down when I finish reading. But American history, that's a very big subject. Would take many years to read.
History of Jamestown, Virginia, 1607–1699. For the National Historic Site, see Historic Jamestown. For the adjacent Living History Museum, see Jamestown Settlement. For later history and commemorations, see Jamestown, Virginia Aftermath and Preservation. Jamestown, also known as Jamestown, was the first settlement of the Virginia colony, founded in 1607, and the capital of Virginia until 1699, when the seat of government was moved to Williamsburg. Arrival and first landing, edit. See also, Timeline of Jamestown, Virginia, European colonization of the Americas, and list of Jamestown colonists. The London Company sent an expedition to establish a settlement in the Virginia colony in December 1606. The expedition consisted of 3 ships: Susan Constant, the largest ship, sometimes known as Sarah Constant, Christopher Newport captain and in command of the group, Godspeed, Bartholomew Gosnold captain, and Discovery, the smallest ship, John Ratcliffe captain. The ships left Blackwall, now part of London, with 105 men and boys and 39 crew members. By the 6th of April, 1607, Godspeed, Susan Constant, and Discovery arrived at the Spanish colony of Puerto Rico, where they stopped for provisions before continuing their journey. By the end of April, the expedition reached the southern edge of the mouth of what is now known as the Chesapeake Bay. After an unusually long journey of more than 4 months, the 104 men and boys, 1 passenger of the original 105 died during the journey, arrived at their chosen settlement spot in Virginia. There were no women on the first ships. They named the Virginia Capes after the sons of their king, the southern Cape Henry, for Henry Frederick, Prince of Wales, and the northern Cape Charles, for his younger brother, Charles, Duke of York. On the 26th of April, upon landing at Cape Henry, they set up a cross near the site of the current Cape Henry Memorial, and Chaplain Robert Hunt made the following declaration: "We do hereby dedicate this land, and ourselves, to reach the people within these shores with the gospel of Jesus Christ, and to raise up godly generations after us, and with these generations take the kingdom of God to all the earth. May this covenant of dedication remain to all generations, as long as this earth remains." May all who see this cross, remember what we have done here, and may those who come here to inhabit join us in this covenant and in this most noble work that the Holy Scriptures may be fulfilled. This site came to be known as the first landing. A party of the men explored the area and had a minor conflict with some Virginia Indians. Exploration, seeking a site, edit. After the expedition arrived in what is now Virginia, sealed orders from the Virginia Company of London were opened. The orders named Captain John Smith as a member of the governing council. He had been arrested for mutiny during the voyage and was incarcerated aboard one of the ships. He had been scheduled to be hanged upon arrival but was freed by Captain Newport after the opening of the orders. The same orders also directed the expedition to seek an inland site for their settlement, which would afford protection from enemy ships. Obedient to their orders, the settlers and crew members reboarded their 3 ships and proceeded into Chesapeake Bay. They landed again at what is now called Old Point Comfort in Hampton. In the following days, seeking a suitable location for their settlement, the ships ventured upstream along the James River. Both the James River and the settlement they sought to establish, Jamestown, originally called James his town, were named in honor of King James I. Selection of Jamestown, edit. On the 14th of May, the colonists chose Jamestown Island for their settlement largely because the Virginia Company advised them to select a location that could be easily defended from attacks by other European states that were also establishing New World colonies and were periodically at war with England, notably the Dutch Republic, France, and Spain. The island fit the criteria as it had excellent visibility up and down the James River, and it was far enough inland to minimize the potential of contact and conflict with enemy ships. The water immediately adjacent to the land was deep enough to permit the colonists to anchor their ships, yet have an easy and quick departure if necessary. An additional benefit of the site was that the land was not occupied by the Virginia Indians, most of whom were affiliated with the Powhatan Confederacy. Largely cut off from the mainland, the shallow harbor afforded the earliest settlers docking of their ships. This was its greatest attraction, but it also created a number of challenging problems for the settlers. Original Council, edit. King James I had outlined the members of the council to govern the settlement in the sealed orders which left London with the colonists in 1606. Those named for the initial council were 1. Bartholomew Gosnold, Captain of Godspeed. 2. Christopher Newport, Captain of Susan Constant, later of Sea Venture. 3. George Kendall, later executed for espionage. 4. John Martin, later founder of Martin's Brandon Plantation. 5. George Percy, twice President of the Council. 6. John Ratcliffe, Captain of Discovery, second President of the Council. 7. John Smith, third President of the Council and author of many books from the period. 8. Edward Maria Wingfield, first President of the Council. Early settlement, edit. Construction of the fort, edit. The settlers came ashore and quickly set about constructing their initial fort. Many of the settlers who came over on the initial 3 ships were not well equipped for the life they found in Jamestown. A number of the original settlers were upper-class gentlemen who were not accustomed to manual labor. The group included very few farmers or skilled laborers. Also notable among the first settlers was Robert Hunt, chaplain who gave the first Christian prayer at Cape Henry on the 26th of April, 1607, and held open-air services at Jamestown until a church was built there. Despite the immediate area of Jamestown being uninhabited, the settlers were attacked less than 2 weeks after their arrival on the 14th of May by Paspahegh Indians who succeeded in killing one of the settlers and wounding 11 more. Within a month, James Fort covered an acre on Jamestown Island. By the 15th of June, the settlers finished building the triangular James Fort. The wooden palisade walls formed a triangle around a storehouse, church, and several houses. A week later, Newport sailed back for London on Susan Constant with a load of pirate, fool's gold, and other supposedly precious minerals, leaving behind 104 colonists and discovery. It soon became apparent why the Virginia Indians did not occupy the site. Jamestown Island, then a peninsula, is a swampy area, and its isolation from the mainland meant that there was limited hunting available, as most game animals require large foraging areas. The settlers quickly hunted and killed off all the large and smaller game animals that were found on the tiny peninsula. In addition, the low, marshy area was infested with airborne pests, including mosquitoes which carried malaria, and the brackish water of the tidal James River was not a good source of water. Over 135 settlers died from malaria, and drinking the salinated and contaminated water caused more deaths from salt poisoning, fevers, and dysentery. Despite their original intentions to grow food and trade with the Virginia Indians, the barely surviving colonists became dependent upon supply missions. First Supply, edit. Main article, Jamestown Supply Mission's First Supply Mission. Newport returned twice from England with additional supplies in the following 18 months, leading what were termed the First and Second Supply Missions. The first supply arrived on the 2nd of January, 1608. It contained insufficient provisions and more than 70 new colonists. Shortly after its arrival, the fort burned down. The council received additional members. Second Supply, edit. Main article, Second Supply. On the 1st of October, 1608, 70 additional settlers arrived aboard the Mary and Margaret with the second supply, following a journey of approximately 3 months. Colonists on the ship included Thomas Graves, Thomas Forrest, Esquires and Mistress Forrest and Anne Burris her maid. Mistress Forrest and Anne Burris were the first 2 women known to have come to the Jamestown colony. Remains unearthed at Jamestown in 1997 may be those of Mistress Forrest. Also included were the first non-English settlers. The company recruited these as skilled craftsmen and industry specialists: soap ash, glass, lumber milling, wainscot, clapboard, and deal, planks, especially softwood planks, and naval stores, pitch, turpentine, and tar. Among these additional settlers were 8 Dutchmen, consisting of unnamed craftsmen and 3 who were probably the woodmill men, Adam, Franz and Samuel. Dutchmen, probably meaning German or German speakers, Polish and Slovak craftsmen, who had been hired by the Virginia Company of London's leaders to help develop and manufacture profitable export products. There has been debate about the nationality of the specific craftsman, and both the Germans and Poles claim the glassmaker for one of their own, but the evidence is insufficient. Ethnicity is further complicated by the fact that the German minority in Royal Prussia lived under Polish control during this period. Originally, the colony's Polish craftsmen were barred from participating in the elections, but after the craftsmen refused to work, colonial leadership agreed to enfranchise them. These workers staged the first recorded strike in colonial America for the right to vote in the colony's 1619 election. Wilhelm Walde, a Swiss-German mineral prospector, was among those who arrived in 1608. His mission was seeking a silver reservoir that was believed to be within the proximity of Jamestown. Some of the settlers were artisans who built a glass furnace which became the first proto-factory in British North America. Additional craftsmen produced soap, pitch, and wood building supplies. Among all of these were the first made-in-America products to be exported to Europe. However, despite all these efforts, profits from exports were not sufficient to meet the expenses and expectations of the investors back in England, and no silver or gold had been discovered, as earlier hoped. Ongoing struggles, edit. Smith's role, edit. In the months before becoming president of the colony for a year in September 1608, Smith did considerable exploration up the Chesapeake Bay and along the various rivers. He is credited by legend with naming Stingray Point, near present-day Deltaville in Middlesex County, for an incident there. Smith was always seeking a supply of food for the colonists, and he successfully traded for food with the Nansemond Indians, who lived along the Nansemond River near the modern-day Suffolk, and several other groups. However, while leading one food-gathering expedition in December 1607, before his term as colony president, this time up the Chickahominy River west of Jamestown, his men were set upon by the Powhatan. As his party was being slaughtered around him, Smith strapped his native guide in front of him as a shield and escaped with his life, but was captured by Opeshankana, the Powhatan chief's half-brother. Smith gave him a compass which pleased the warrior and made him decide to let Smith live. Smith was taken before Wayhunts Unicock, who was commonly referred to as Chief Powhatan, at the Powhatan Confederacy's seat of government at Werowocomoco on the York River. However, 17 years later, in 1624, Smith first related that when the chief decided to execute him, this course of action was stopped by the pleas of Chief Powhatan's young daughter, Pocahontas, who was originally named Matoka but whose nickname meant playful mischief. Many historians today find this account dubious, especially as it was omitted in all his previous versions. Smith returned to Jamestown just in time for the first supply in January 1608. In September 1609, Smith was wounded in an accident. He was walking with his gun in the river, and the powder was in a pouch on his belt. His powder bag exploded. In October, he was sent back to England for medical treatment. While back in England, Smith wrote A True Relation and the Proceedings of the English Colony of Virginia about his experiences in Jamestown. These books, whose accuracy has been questioned by some historians due to some extent by Smith's boastful prose, were to generate public interest and new investment for the colony. Virginia Company of London's Unrealistic Expectations, edit. The investors of the Virginia Company of London expected to reap rewards from their speculative investments. With the second supply, they expressed their frustrations and made demands upon the leaders of Jamestown in written form. It fell to the third president of the council to deliver a reply. By this time, Wingfield and Ratcliffe had been replaced by Smith. Ever bold, Smith delivered what must have been a wake-up call to the investors in London. In what has been termed Smith's rude answer, he composed a letter, writing, in part, "When you send again I entreat you rather send but 30 carpenters, husbandmen, gardeners, fishermen, blacksmiths, masons and diggers up of trees, roots, well provided, than 1,000 of such or have, for except we be able both to lodge them and feed them, the most will consume with want of necessaries before they can be made good for anything." Smith did begin his letter with something of an apology, saying, "I humbly entreat your pardons if I offend you with my rude answer," although at the time, the word rude was acknowledged to mean unfinished or rural, in the same way modern English uses rustic. There are strong indications that those in London comprehended and embraced Smith's message. Their third supply mission was by far the largest and best equipped. They even had a new purpose-built flagship constructed, Sea Venture, placed in the most experienced of hands, Christopher Newport. With a fleet of no fewer than 8 ships, the third supply, led by Sea Venture, left Plymouth in June 1609. Pocahontas, edit. Although the life of Chief Powhatan's young daughter, Pocahontas, would be largely tied to the English after legend credits her with saving Smith's life after his capture by Opechancanough, her contacts with Smith were minimal. However, records indicate that she became something of an emissary to the colonists at Jamestown Island. During their first winter, following an almost complete destruction of their fort by a fire in January 1608, Pocahontas brought food and clothing to the colonists. She later negotiated with Smith for the release of Virginia Indians who had been captured by the colonists during a raid to gain English weaponry. During the next several years, the relationship between the Virginia Indians and the colonists became more strained, never more so than during the period of poor crops for both the natives and colonists, which became known as the Starving Time in late 1609 and early 1610. Chief Powhatan relocated his principal capital from Werowocomoco, which was relatively close to Jamestown along the north shore of the York River, to a point more inland and secure along the upper reaches of the Chickahominy River. In April 1613, Pocahontas and her husband, Kocoum, were residing at Passapatanzee, a village of the Patawimecs, a Powhatan Confederacy tribe which did some trading with Powhatans. They lived in present-day Stafford County on the Potomac River near Fredericksburg, about 65 miles, 105 kilometers, from Werowocomoco. She was abducted by Englishmen whose leader was Samuel Argall and transported about 90 miles, 140 kilometers, south to the English settlement at Henricus on the James River. There, Pocahontas converted to Christianity and took the name Rebecca under the tutelage of Reverend Alexander Whitaker, who had arrived in Jamestown in 1611. She married prominent planter John Rolfe, who had lost his first wife and child in the journey from England several years earlier, which served to greatly improve relations between the Virginia Native Americans and the colonists for several years. However, when she and Rolfe took their young son Thomas Rolfe on a public relations trip to England to help raise more investment money for the Virginia Company, she became ill and died just as they were leaving to return to Virginia. Her interment was at St. George's Church in Gravesend. Starving Time, edit. What became known as the Starving Time in the Virginia colony occurred during the winter of 1609-10, when only 60 of 500 English colonists survived. The colonists had never planned to grow all of their own food. Instead, their plans depended upon trade with the local Virginia Indians to supply them with enough food between the arrival of periodic supply ships from England, upon which they also relied. This period of extreme hardship for the colonists began in 1609 with a drought which caused their already limited farming activities to produce even fewer crops than usual. Then, there were problems with both of their other sources for food. An unexpected delay occurred during the Virginia Company of London's third supply mission from England, so much needed food and supplies were unavailable for the winter. After Smith left for England to tend to his injuries, Chief Powhatan severely curtailed trading with the colonists for food. Instead, the Powhatans used the prospect of trading for corn to betray an expedition led by Smith's successor, John Ratcliffe. Ratcliffe was lured by the prospect of food but was kidnapped, tortured, and murdered by the Powhatans. Neither the missing Sea Venture nor any other supply ship arrived as winter set upon the inhabitants of the young colony in late 1609. Third supply, edit. Leaving England in 1609, Vice Admiral Christopher Newport was in charge of a 9-vessel fleet. Aboard the flagship Sea Venture was the Admiral of the company, George Somers, Lieutenant General Thomas Gates, William Strachey and other notable personages in the early history of English colonization in North America. While at sea, the fleet encountered a strong storm. perhaps a hurricane, which lasted for 3 days. Sea Venture and one other ship were separated from the 7 other vessels of the fleet. Sea Venture was deliberately driven onto the reefs of Bermuda to prevent her sinking. The 150 passengers and crew members were all landed safely, but the ship was permanently damaged. Sea Venture's longboat was later fitted with a mast and sent to find Virginia, but it and its crew were never seen again. The remaining survivors spent 9 months on Bermuda building 2 smaller ships, Deliverance and Patience, from Bermuda cedar and materials salvaged from Sea Venture. The survivors of the shipwreck of Sea Venture finally arrived at Jamestown the following the 23rd of May, 1610. They found the Virginia colony in ruins and practically abandoned. Of 500 settlers who had preceded them to Jamestown, they found fewer than 100 survivors, many of whom were sick or dying. Worse yet, the Bermuda survivors had brought few supplies and only a small amount of food with them, expecting to find a thriving colony at Jamestown. Thus, even with the arrival of the 2 small ships from Bermuda under Newport, they were faced with leaving Jamestown and returning to England. On June the 7th, having abandoned the fort and many of their possessions, both groups of survivors, from Jamestown and Bermuda, boarded ships, and they all set sail down the James River toward the Chesapeake Bay and the Atlantic Ocean. Lord de la Warr, edit. See also, Jamestown Supply Mission's 4th Supply Mission. During the same period that Sea Venture suffered its misfortune and its survivors were struggling in Bermuda to continue on to Virginia, back in England, the publication of Captain John Smith's books of his adventures in Virginia sparked a resurgence in interest in the colony. This helped lead to the dispatch in early 1610 of additional colonists, more supplies, and a new governor, Thomas West, Baron de la Warr. Fortuitously, on the 9th of June, 1610, de la Warr arrived on the James River just as the settlers had abandoned Jamestown. Intercepting them about 10 miles, 16 kilometers, downstream from Jamestown near Mulberry Island, adjacent to present-day Fort Eustis in Newport News, the new governor forced the remaining 90 settlers to return. Deliverance and Patience turned back, and all the settlers were landed again at Jamestown. With the new supply mission, the de la Warr brought additional colonists, a doctor, food, and much-needed supplies. De la Warr proved to be a new kind of leader for Virginia. Somers returned to Bermuda with Patience to obtain more food supplies, but he died on the island that summer. His nephew, Matthew Somers, captain of Patience, took the ship back to Lyme Regis, England instead of Virginia, leaving a 3rd man behind. The 3rd charter of the Virginia Company was then extended far enough across the Atlantic to include Bermuda in 1612. Although a separate company, the Summerscales Company would be spun off to administer Bermuda from 1615. The first 2 successful English colonies would retain close ties for many more generations, as was demonstrated when Virginian General George Washington called upon the people of Bermuda for aid during the American War of Independence. In 1613, Thomas Dale founded the settlement of Bermuda Hundred on the James River, which, a year later, became the first incorporated town in Virginia. Expansion beyond Jamestown, edit. By 1611, a majority of the colonists who had arrived at the Jamestown settlement had died, and its economic value was negligible with no active exports to England and very little internal economic activity. Only financial incentives to investors financing the new colony, including a promise of more land to the west from King James I, kept the project afloat. First Anglo-Powhatan War, edit. Main article, First Anglo-Powhatan War. The Anglo-Powhatan Wars were 3 wars fought between English settlers of the Virginia colony and Indians of the Powhatan Confederacy in the early 17th century. The first war started in 1610 and ended in a peace settlement in 1614. Tobacco, edit. In 1610, John Rolfe, whose wife and a child had died in Bermuda during passage in the third supply to Virginia, was just one of the settlers who had arrived in Jamestown following the shipwreck of Sea Venture. Rolfe was the first man to successfully raise export tobacco in the colony, although the colonists